I got a couple more clues from listening to Steve Pavlina, Day 20, and he was talking today about our relationship with the simulator, in quotes. So he calls reality the simulator sometimes. And what he was talking about, without going too much into how he uses his terminology, because that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is taking some of the clues that he gave me that weren't about me, but I'm making them about me, because I can create my own meaning. So he was talking about how he developed the skill of lucid dreaming. I don't have this skill that I know of. And lucid dreaming is where one can learn to realize one's dreaming and then not wake up and control the dream. So one could be dreaming something and then realize, oh, I'm dreaming, so I'm going to fly, or I'm going to climb up this tree, or whatever. So it's like controlling the dream, which is lucid dreaming. And the first thing I want to say about that is, in so-called mania, in a way we realize life is like a dream, or life seems more like a dream, or happens more like a dream, because things happen in a meaningful way, and they happen in ways that are beyond belief. Like one could be thinking about a person, for example, and then they show up in mania, not in a dream, but in one's real life experience. So it's almost like we realize we're dreaming so we can control the dream to some extent. But I don't think that we're the controller. I think the universe is the controller. So what I'm trying to say is, in mania, the world is kind of dream-like. Things can happen magically and synchronistically and in unbelievable ways, kind of like a dream. And I think what can happen is, in mania, is there is a sort of dreaming while awake algorithm in the brain. So there's lucid dreaming, where one becomes consciously aware one is dreaming and then controls the dream. And I think what happens in mania is that the person, whether they know it or not, has been woken up from the dream of objectivity. And one is more in contact with subjectivity, like a dreamer would be. But I don't know if we are usually aware of this. It just sort of changes and is kind of magical, and we're like, this is strange. But I think that which realizes it, that which wakes up, is something more universal. So it could be a universal human consciousness. It's not that a self or a thought is aware that one is dreaming. Like the self is this structure of thinking, and in order to wake up while awake, that self-structure needs to actually dissipate, because that self-structure is that actually which is wasting our energy in lower energetic states of the brain, because it's repetitive. So all of a sudden now we're in this really awake state where nothing feels like repetition. Everything feels so new. We're looking at something as if it's for the first time. And in a way, that's because we're not looking through thought. We're not looking through the lens of the thought of self. We're just looking. So there's something totally different. We think of ourselves as this self, but when that's gone, something else is looking. And that something else feels like, wow, I'm looking for the first time at all this. It's so beautiful, because it's not looking through the lens of thought. And this is an awakeness within our brain that has nothing to do with thought. So what I'm trying to say is, there's a bit of a trap in this, because there's no self to be self-conscious of this. and be like, oh, look, I'm awake now. No, that's not the way it works. There's an awakening, but there's nobody there that's awakened. The somebody that thinks it's there is thinking, the thought structure. And that lens of looking through the thought structure and looking through our own projections, looking through our own memories, stops. And that's why everything looks so fresh, because we're not looking through the past. We're looking at the now. And so that which looks is not thought, and that which is the conglomeration of thought is the self. So there's nothing to be conscious of being awake. So in a way, when we start to awaken, we don't even know. We don't even know that we were sleeping, and we don't know that looking through the lens of thought was technically sleepwalking. And now we're awake. We're looking at everything for the first time, and everything looks so beautiful, because it really is. Thought tells us it's all mediocre and mundane and boring and repetitive, because that's what thought is. So I'm trying to point out that being awake, awakening, is kind of like dreaming, because everything feels like one consciousness, because there isn't a separation of I'm the thinker looking. I'm the self looking at the world. It's the world looking at itself, and it's just one thing. So the duality is gone. So when the duality is gone, who is the one to know that the duality is gone? There's nobody there to know. So that's part of the trouble of it. Whereas lucid dreaming is a bit the opposite. It's like, oh wow, I know I'm dreaming and now I can do anything. But it's not really that way when we wake up, when we're awake. We didn't know we were sleepwalking. And then we don't know that we're awake, because the sleepwalking is the self, and then when it's gone, it doesn't even really know that it's gone. So the thing that's similar about lucid dreaming and the state of mania, which is being really awake, being awake and dreaming versus being asleep and knowing one's dreaming, so being conscious of the dream and lucid dreaming, the similarity is that since it works a bit like a dream, like the dream stuff is the same as the dreamer, when we're awake, the material world is the same stuff as the dreamer of the material world. And the similar thing is that when that happens, we might start thinking that life works like a dream where we can literally fly. Some people might think they can fly in mania because life seems like a dream, and the way that it's like a dream is there's no duality between any of it. It's all one substance. All material is all of consciousness, and the material is actually alive, like a dream. It's not this static thing. So that's why sometimes we begin to test reality in a lot of different ways. And the thing is, when we are awake, we are subject to some of the physical laws, but we're just not sure which ones, because things happen. When one is wide awake, the material world responds differently. It does respond more like a dream. It responds in a sort of quantum physics type way, as opposed to a Newtonian way. And one sees that other things are possible than what we thought. And then something else he said that was interesting about when he was learning how to lucid dream was that he said at first he would only be able to lucid dream for a few seconds, because as soon as he realized that he was asleep and dreaming, he'd get a bit excited and his heart would pound and he'd wake up. So he had to learn to not get all excited like this, to be able to stay in that lucid dreaming state. And I sort of now see that as So he realizes he's dreaming, his heart pounds, and he wakes up. Well, for some reason, when I have the positive energy, which is moving more in like a higher brain energy state, which then allows the material world to respond differently to my brain and consciousness. It responds more as one thing. What often happens, because I do spend some time reading and studying, is that I have an insight and I write it down, and then I pick up a book and it's there. So it happens in the other way. It's not like I read something and write it down. It comes to mind, and then I'll just pick up a random book and it'll be there. Or look at an email and they'll be saying what just came to mind. Just like how I was talking about, my brain cells talking, and then watching that video and it's saying that cells understand English. So not exactly the same thing, but it really was an external prover to what came to mind in my brain. So the material world is responding. A DVD is responding to what came to my mind and what I said to myself. So in that way, it's happening. Something comes into consciousness, then like the next thing I listen to or watch says the same thing that I just said originally to myself. So it's, in my way, it's like the universe saying yes to me. It's like my brain cells are talking about themselves, and then I watch something and it kind of confirms. So I could go and do all the scientific studies, or I could be like, wow, the universe just showed me the same thing after it came to mind. Not that I thought it. So, back to the lucid dreaming, he's saying that when he realizes that he's dreaming, at first he got excited and his heart pounds, and that wakes him up. And I realized that when I get to the end of this extra energy after 5 months, I usually have trouble sleeping. And what happens is I'm trying to sleep and my heart pounds and wakes me up. And so it's happening in sort of an opposite way. It's happening almost like the whole 5 months was kind of more like the lucid dream, which I'm saying in the level of waking reality is being extra awake, and that makes reality respond more like a dream, not that it is a dream, but more like a dream as in it's one field of consciousness that is alive. The whole field is living, just like in dreaming. So what I'm saying is, it could be that at the end of that 5 months, it's like I can't sleep and my heart pounds and wakes me up because I'm sort of going back down into the lower level of reality, which is where the brain perceives more in an objective way. And I've been able to transcend that heart pounding, waking me up. It's almost like the heart is resisting going back into objective perception mode. In the lower energy state, it doesn't want to. And so my heart pounds and kind of wants to reawaken me to stay in the awake state, because I'm about to sort of go through this wormhole into a different energetic brain state, which is more like objectivity, like how everyone kind of is. And the last couple times that's happened, I've managed to stay out of the hospital, but it was very challenging. Last time I got through pretty easy. The time before was awful. And the time before wasn't too bad. But each time that I've had these crisis events, the crisis is usually my heart pounding, just as Steve described it in a different context of learning how to lucid dream. And so I'm seeing it as the opposite. My body's resisting coming out of being wide awake and being sort of one consciousness with reality, which the first time it happened in my 1 month of mania, it felt so magical and wonderful. But now I feel like my brain's used to it. It doesn't feel so magical. Like each time I don't think, oh, I can fly. The first time I might have thought I could fly and walk through walls, but I couldn't. And so I learned. And the next time it comes along, I don't test that again, because I learned last time that's not the way it works. So there's a learning that can happen in that state over time. And if it doesn't happen, well, that's not very intelligent. So what I'm saying too is when those crisis events happened and I was re-hospitalized, like my heart would pound, I would be afraid. It's like my brain is afraid to go back into perceiving the world as a separate object, as objects against objects, as being a Newtonian brain. And what's the psych system there for? It's to be like, oh, it's okay to be yourself and you're going to recover, blah, blah, blah. We're going to medicate you to help lower the energy of your brain, because it seems like the brain is resisting lowering the energy, and part of the fear happens because we just don't have the nutrients and the capacity to keep accelerating in that way. And it might not necessarily be bad. It's probably good to be able to accelerate. The deceleration kind of sucks, but I think it's better to be able to do that than to be stuck on a treadmill, an energetic brain treadmill. That would be awful. So what I'm trying to say is the first 3 times I had a crisis, I ended up re-hospitalized. And, you know, it seems interesting how reality plays out. When I was re-hospitalized and, you know, I was in these good states of mind, and then I have this crisis, and what I'm saying is my brain's trying to resist going back to seeing objectively, seeing through thoughts. The brain's resisting having the self-structure, the conditioned self-structure come back online. And since I wasn't able to go through that by myself at the time, I feel like part of the clue that this could be part of what's happening is that when I was hospitalized in that crisis of, you know, resisting going through that like dimensional portal, that brain portal, the psych system is there to objectify me. So if I don't learn how to go from subjective consciousness, which is kind of like mania, being wide awake, well awake, which is why it's hard to sleep sometimes, because we're so awake and we're sped up. So, and we have more energy in our brain. It's harder for the brain to calm down and go to sleep. And also, the brain is wide awake, and the next level down is actually sleepwalking, awake. You know, sleeping while walking around, supposedly awake. So if one's in the energetic state, it can be harder to sleep because one has to literally go through, like, the brain sees being awake based on thought as sleeping. So it's almost like you are sleeping, but you're not. So it's hard to get past that level and go to sleep, what was sleep before. So what I'm trying to say is, if I can learn to get through this deceleration, this lowering of the energy of the brain, which makes it go from a subjective, energized, wide awake, creative perception, perceiving meaning everywhere, moving according to it, and life is pretty fun that way because it feels full of meaning, subjective meaning, to the brain moving based on objective meaning of being told what things mean. Like, life is about this and this and this, and, you know, it's all sort of cut and dry, and, like, follow these projections and you'll be happy, which isn't happiness. So the brain's doing that thing, and our behaviors are such that often we're afraid of this process, and since we're afraid of it, we end up getting captured by psychiatry and being objectified, when really we need to learn how to go between subjective and objective consciousness. And then we don't need to be objectified by a medical profession if we can learn to go between those different states without it being noticed by a medical system and turned into a medical problem. It's not necessarily a medical problem. And I still do use psych meds right now to fall asleep. which I'm pretty grateful for because it slows down my brain enough to be able to sleep. And if I can sleep enough, less hours in the day that I'm awake, the less hours I have to accelerate. And the last point, I can make one point or talk about one little thing and it goes on for like 25 minutes. Steve was talking about how, at first when he learned to lucid dream, it was like a few seconds, and then longer, and then longer. And then eventually he realized, hey, this is a skill set, because if I'm lucid dreaming, I need to learn how to climb up this tree in a lucid dream, or I need to learn how to fly in a lucid dream. Or so there were certain constraints. It's not like, oh, I'm lucid dreaming and I can have anything I want in the dream, even though it was lucid. So he's saying this could mean that there's certain constraints on objective reality too. Just because we get into an abundant consciousness doesn't mean everything is just going to be on our plate that we ever wanted. There's still a skill to going about doing what we want. And so I think this could be something that is important for so-called mania too. And I think there is a skill in it. I feel like what's happening is we need to learn how to do things with that type of subjective consciousness. And one thing we don't necessarily realize when we first go into it is that other people are probably in objective consciousness. And our subjective meaning that we're seeing can subtly affect them. But if we try to force that on them, they will probably, there'll be an energetic retaliation. I feel that if we provoke the reflex of thought in other people, then it's like the Newtonian billiard ball effect. So we might think we're doing something good, but it's going to come back at us. And that could be part of what messes up the energy of it. And I think that creating our own understanding, if I've gotten to myself to the point where understanding that doing too much in that state actually isn't necessarily a good thing, it might feel good for me personally, but to take it as something that is personally pleasurable might be a mistake. It might be part of what recoalesces the self as thinking of itself as a separate person by making it a personally pleasurable thing. I don't know, but the thing too, I think when we first go into mania is that we get into a celebratory state of consciousness. We celebrate. And if we're happy and celebrating, woo, and people notice that, they're kind of why are you celebrating? There's nothing to be that happy about in this moment. So they're kind of putting energy back at us. So I think we got to keep our celebration to ourselves, unless we create some kind of mania festival where we can all be happy for no reason, without causality, without cause. And I do think that a model where the universe is trying to wake us up from sleepwalking as repetitive thoughts and reflexes of thoughts, we're really not free. We're marionetted by these thoughts, and when that energy comes in, we're free from that to some extent. So part of the action could be not acting based on our pre-conditioned ways, because the energy can come in and actually augment the ways of our thinking action reflexes, which only energizes equal and opposite thought force back against us. So that's pretty long-winded, and this is another funny one that he mentioned based on the simulator that relates to something that I've already said to myself. He was talking about an example of kind of a weird example. He was saying a 10-hour flight to another city could literally be the time that the simulator needs to render a new city. So bring up the programming from a new city, and then we get there, and we're tired from jet lag, and then we need to sleep, which gives the simulator more time to process and build the scenes of the city. So he's literally talking about a flight represents the time of the simulator needing to create the new city versus, literally objectively flying from one city to another. And that could be seen as really impossible, but I saw a very similarity with what I talked about in terms of how in so-called mania, it seems like one speeds up and, thinks of all these thoughts and almost goes into future consciousness, like the future higher energy processing of the brain with more energy going into different areas of the brain, different algorithm altogether. So one's like flying into different brain speeds. The brain is literally taking off for X amount of time. And now when one does that, most other people's brains around is just like walking, So a person in mania is like taking off in flight, flying to the future, and then people are like walking to that same city. And so what happens is a person in mania sort of at some point decelerates, slows down. The brain loses energy, and one has like a come down effect, like being high, but one wasn't taking anything. So one was like high, and now one's having the come down effect, and it's awful. And I said to myself that could actually be like reality needing to catch up, like slowing down and waiting for the others to walk there in the ripple off the wings of the flight of the manic brain. So that's like creates a ripple to the future, and other brains can like kind of slowly walk there too. And it could be that the manic brain flies and then comes all the way back to the beginning, but they've created those ripples so other brains can perhaps fly too. So one could also think of it in terms of a simulator, like a manic brain's gone further into the simulator, being able to simulate what one wants, or what's more congruent with how one was born versus how one was conditioned and programmed. And then all of a sudden, I don't even know if we fly back or the brakes are stepped on abruptly, and then, sometimes we're maybe depressed for months, and that could be the time that everyone is doing their patterns to catch up a little bit to where you landed. And I kind of think that that's possibly partly true. If I spend months in a room, then, all the different complexities of the world are going on, and I might have just spent months going into dimensions of reality that aren't accessible to anyone. But by me going there, it's possible that those ripples create little paths for other people to be able to go there to some extent too. I think that could be possible. And that's why I feel that a lot of what needs to change, what I'm going to experiment with next, or what it seems I've been experimenting with in a way, is letting things change on the level of the brain and not so much worrying about action. Allowing the brain cells to speak from where it's been and what it's seen, but not necessarily trying to be like, hey everyone, let's go, like come this way. If you just come this way with me, like you'll see it, everything will be fine. People aren't necessarily going to see it, but I think each time one does that, if one creates words, those words create ripples in the field, which other people can tune into too. Like imagine if somebody in mania sees something or has an insight come to mind, like a sentence or some words come to mind that have never been thought before. It's a new thought. It's from somewhere else. And if someone says it out loud, like I say it out loud to myself, it could be changing the field, and then other people think it too. And they don't know where it came from. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if that's true, but I just feel that being too excited and celebrating too much, like it's already there, is maybe not our role. Our role could be to accelerate and decelerate horizontally, and not necessarily to transcend and go into like enlightenment realms, because the acceleration into love shows us a lot, and the deceleration back into thought structures that might lead to anger and different not so great things can show us a lot too. Like I saw the subtle way that it wants to reattach the brain to the thinking reflex conglomerate that we've all been programmed with, and putting up a no to that while living in it could be just as powerful as going into future consciousness and almost living in the future in this wonderful heavenly realm that already exists here now. We just can't see because we're looking through thought structures. So back to a little bit more of what I read in the seizure stuff. One thing I read says that during their EEG training, this person learned that what they said was, when a nerve cell became irritated, it gave off an extra large burst of electricity. So they're talking about this in terms of seizures. And I don't know if this is still relevant today or what, but it's interesting, the wording, when a nerve cell became irritated. How does a nerve cell become irritated? That's like almost saying it has a human emotion or whatever. I think nerve cells could become irritated by trauma. Nerve cells could become irritated by the way the senses have been conditioned by thought. And it could be this burst of energy that creates that electrical energy. So a lot of people who have mental health diagnoses, they have some kind of trauma. And one could think, well, trauma could irritate the nerve cells or the brain cells or anything. They're irritated, that maybe they're irritated that happened. Maybe they're irritated that this consensus world led to that. And so maybe when they're irritated, they give off a burst of energy, and this is part of what is able to energize the brain into a different state, to see the world differently. So that the brain's not irritated. It's like it gets so irritated, it releases this energy, and then all of a sudden it's able to see all this meaning and perceive creatively instead of perceiving through thought. And it's interesting too, it said that seizures affect the senses, like taste, touch, smell, sight, and sound. So, this burst of electricity that could possibly happen in so-called mania, for example, it could affect the senses. We could hear differently, we could see differently. It could be the burst of energy that affects the senses and makes our senses more sensitive. And another thing it said was that every seizure places enormous demands on the nutritional status of the body, leaving the person depleted of many nutrients. I can't remember where I read that exactly, I'm sorry, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that same thing could happen after a couple months of mania, it makes sense that that higher energy or electricity in the brain could also put demands on the nutritional status of the body, and that might be why the brain has to go back to objectivity, because having repetitive thoughts go through the brain is part of what lowers its energy, and it suppresses brain activity. It has an overemphasis on the prefrontal cortex and doesn't allow energy to go to other areas of the brain. So I think conditioned thought is almost the same as a tranquilizer. It tranquilizes us into believing that we're these separate selves, and we waste a lot of energy defending that. One other thing I didn't mention yet about the amino acids I was researching, somewhere I came across that glutamine is something that helps to make glutathione, which is a master antioxidant. But it also said that glutamine provides energy to neurons when blood sugar levels are low. So that could be important, because I think something that happens in so-called mania is that we use up a lot of our blood sugar energy. So at times we could be low on it, which could stress the neurons out, because perhaps they're trying to make new molecules and maybe even new genes, but don't have the energy for it. And it says that cabbage, raw and red, is a good source of glutamine. So I'll probably forget that, but there is some glutamine in this, which is good for now, I think. And something else to go with that is, since my energy's switched in the last couple weeks, I've been drinking so much water lately. And I've been going a little bit more, like quite a bit more. And I think what happens is my body starts detoxing, because when I'm in sort of the thought, history, objective mode, lower energy brain state, not much is happening in terms of thinking of new meanings and memes and things, which I think is part of the new function of that energetic state, and then decelerating to bring it back to, so-called objective consciousness. I think part of what happens is, in the sort of lower energy state, one is attracted to lower energy foods and like junk food and candy, and I haven't been as hungry. And I think part of what happens is that it's happened to me before. Usually when I go into a higher energy state, I lose weight. And I think it's because the body changes its metabolism. It probably goes into a ketosis without even having to avoid carbohydrates. And I think that would happen because the body needs the food that it's eating, plus it also just burns off all the fat to use it for energy for the brain in the form of ketone bodies. So I'll probably lose weight from being less hungry, and it could be partly too because the body is drawing on the stores that it stored up when it was in lower energy state and not able to process as much energy, burn off as much energy, and attracted to sort of lower energy foods. I think that's part of what happens. One time I was trying to eat. It's almost like the body preferentially eats up all that toxic stuff because I was eating really healthy, but it was just going right through me, and my body just kept eating its own fat. And I went down to 90 pounds. Right now I think I'm about 120, so I have about 10 pounds to donate to new machinations of the mind. And what else do I want to talk about? Steve Pavlina wrote an article years ago called List of Values, and it's at stevepavlina.com /list-of-values. And he was talking about what values align you with what you might want to do to earn income and blah blah. And I wrote down that people who are bipolar, we have an abundance of subjective meaning, creative perception, and that capacity. We might not have the whole abundance of subjective meaning in our memory, but we're able to have the capacity to create meaning subjectively in the moment. And then I wrote down that we need acceptance. So I was realizing that some of the values on his list are some of them that we need coming towards us. We might need different values coming towards us from others than the ones that we get connected with, that might be a totally different value system that we have when we're more in the objective consciousness of our conditioned thought growing up. So I wrote down a bunch of words, and of the list of values, quite a few of them, and I feel some of them are ones we might need to dampen down, and others we might need to grow into, and others we might have in mania but we don't necessarily have all the time. Maybe it's possible that if we are grounded in those higher states of love, maybe we would have these all the time. But in bipolar, it's quite well known that sometimes we go back into a consciousness where we can be angry or upset or things like that. And I did explain in another video that there could be a biological reason for this, like the monkey that was behind the one-way mirror, and he was trying to show that his dominance, which could be seen as the manic trying to communicate the meaning and the memes and the creative perceptions that they have, and people not responding to it because they can't see the value of it. And since it's not mirrored back, we get angry. Just like when the monkey was behind a one-way mirror, he could see his clan or whatever it's called, but the monkeys couldn't see him, so they couldn't respond submissively. And I'm not trying to say that people need to respond submissively to us. I think people need to respond in dialogue, and accept that we're trying to say something that could have some value. When that happens, that monkey loses, I think, serotonin or something, and then they become really agitated. So, their function is to be the alpha monkey, and the others know that. And when they can't see and respond because of the one-way mirror, the monkey gets really mad. So I think there's sort of a one-way mirror when we look at people in a psychiatric way. We're looking at them in order to objectify people who are in those states of consciousness, but we don't necessarily think, hey, they can help to subjectify us. We can help to subjectify others. And there's different values that need to come towards us, but some of the ones that I wrote down, sometimes we feel really altruistic, so altruism might be a value, but we might not have the means to be super altruistic. Oftentimes after a diagnosis, we're living in poverty. So that might be something that we can move towards. And then articulacy, I think we need to move towards this being a value of being able to articulate our subjectivity with each other and create that context and that type of paradigm and framework. Attentiveness, awareness, awe, beauty. We might need some bravery to be able to speak up. And naturally we have this bravery without thinking about it, or courage when we're in mania. We're very courageous. And calmness, we might need to work on that sometimes. bliss, we might need to reduce the bliss, and take stuff out of the pleasure circuits and put it somewhere else, and increase our capability and our capacity. We have a large capacitance of words that we haven't been able to share. And change, we're good at that. Community, we need more of that. So in those states I felt like, I need community, but I haven't necessarily been able to create that. So it could be of value, but it's not something that is an actuality. Compassion, having the ability to be compassionate as well as having it towards us. Connection, consciousness, contribution. We do want to make a contribution, I feel. Cooperation, creativity, curiosity, energy. Sometimes we have too much energy. Dreaming, like in terms of living our dreams. We might need to decrease the personal ecstasy and channel that energy somewhere else if it makes us behave in too much celebration. I feel we really need to educate ourselves about what's going on, and empathy, enjoyment, excellence, exploration. I added extrapolation, resonance, family, financial independence, fitness, flow, freedom, friendliness, friendship, fun, and generosity, giving, growth, guidance, happiness, harmony, health, heroism, honesty, humility, humor, influence, individuality, inquisitiveness, insightfulness, inspiration, intelligence, intensity, introspection, intuition, inventiveness, joy, kindness, learning, lightness, liveliness, love, making a difference, mastery, meaning, mindfulness, motivation. Our motivation is kind of our own subjective creative perception and not the driver of thought, which tells us what to be motivated about, which might be relatively meaningless. Mysteriousness, mystery, nature, non-conformity, open-mindedness, openness, organization, reorganize, consciousness, originality, outdoors, outlandishness, outrageousness. Sometimes we might need to decrease that, right? We might value it in certain states. Partnership, patience, passion, peace, perceptiveness, playfulness, power, practicality, presence, recreation instead of recreation, creativity, resilience, resourcefulness, responsibility, selflessness or less self, sharing, silence, silliness, simplicity, skillfulness, solitude, spirituality, spontaneity, stealth, strength, scaffolding. I put scaffolding there. Synergy, teaching, teamwork, transcendence, and truth, understanding, unflappability, uniqueness, vision, vitality, warm-heartedness, volunteering, wisdom, wonder. There were a lot more values on that from Steve Pavlina, and I just feel like some of these we need to increase and some of them we need to decrease. We need to be aware when certain of these come online and take precedence, and then when they sort of move out. And maybe we could even elaborate on some of these, like, hey, what visions did I have? What volunteering would I like to do? Who do I feel warm-heartedness towards? Or maybe I need warm-heartedness, and where can I get this in times that I need it? And what's my uniqueness? Things like that. So I wanted to share that for whatever reason, and I think that's all I'll talk about for now. Tomorrow I'm going to go downtown and meet up with someone who might give me something to try that I'll talk about after I try it. Maybe. And hopefully I have a good sleep. Talk later. So much to talk about. I don't know where to start. I went downtown and met up with a new friend of mine, and he is quite into CBD compounding. And I've recently learned that CBD is quite different than THC. THC is the more psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, and CBD has completely different effects. And I haven't studied it enough to know a ton about it, but my friend that I met up with has. So he made me a transdermal cream. And I don't know if this is like a secret recipe, so I don't want to share exactly what's in it, even though it's on the label. So I don't think it's really a secret. But he has a license to grow medicinal cannabis, and he's growing, or he has CBD. He has all the ingredients. He has quite a setup. I was really impressed. He knows CBD and THC and marijuana like I know my supplement regime that I have all right here. And so he made me this cream, transdermal cream, which means it goes through your skin. And I saw the stuff he had, and he said, hey, you can make this for yourself. I would probably wait until it's legalized, because I don't have a license to have this stuff like he does. And so he showed me how to make it, and it's kind of cool. And he also talked about putting other things in transdermal cream. I learned that sunflower lecithin, which is something I take, if you get the liquid, it can help make things pass through the blood-brain barrier. So he knows a lot of stuff about that, and that's cool because I really like the biochemistry stuff, the supplements. So this is kind of like supplement. So it's supposed to be put on the back of the head, and there was a bit left over, so I kind of rubbed it on the back of my head and my body. And then we went for coffee, and I was feeling kind of like sleepy, like my eyes felt like, so I wouldn't use it during the day. Since I already used a little bit today, I will probably not use any tonight, because I'm going to be taking a quarter of Zopicone for the next few days, and I'll probably take this on Friday night, and because I won't be taking Zopicone. So replace something more natural with something that is not natural, like the Zopicone, which I want to stop taking, and I'm feeling like I will be able to stop taking it. This morning my eyes were feeling tired, and then I used my blue light, which I probably shouldn't turn on right now because it's late, but after using that for a little while, the tiredness in my eyes went away. And this is based on some of the chemicals of like essential oils and stuff. And yeah, so I'm curious to know what kind of effect it will have. And I think this guy is really on to something. He's on to some really cool stuff. And I mentioned to myself that I might try and get some CBD oil myself when I go to California. And yeah, I don't know. I think this is really cool. And again, I won't share too much about the science of it because I don't know. He did send me a patent of something that I can read, and he's going to send me more information to read. But this goes along with what I usually do, is when I come across something cool and somebody who really knows their stuff about something, I kind of trust them, because if I don't, I have to study as much as they did in order to know as much as they did. And I'd personally rather trust the person and their expertise and their passion about a certain topic than go and spend years trying to study this stuff. Like, his setup was really cool, and I appreciated how many hours must have gone into researching all these these biomolecules, researching the transdermal cream, researching this pump, researching every little item that he had there and all the different oils. He called them terpenes, which are like certain phytochemicals and stuff like that. So I felt kind of honored to have somebody sharing what would have taken them a really long time and passion and energy to research with me. I was a little bit stunned, like, wow, thank you. And I really said, thank you for sharing this. Like, obviously this took you a long time, and here you are sharing this with me and saying, here, I'll share with you enough information so you can make this yourself. Like, I'm not going to be like hiding it from you. So I thought that was cool. So I'm going to try this out in the coming days. One thing I did notice when I was driving home was that I was singing, and I swear I could sing better because I'd put some here and it felt like maybe it loosened the nerves in my neck and my face and just made me be able to sing a little bit better. Though I did have a bit of a clogged throat for a couple days, and I usually have talked to myself about how when I have that, I think the throat is rebuilding itself and preparing itself for the next level of being able to get better at singing. And the reason why I talk about this a little bit is when I was little, I wanted to be a singer. That was like what I wanted to do, even though I couldn't sing. But I didn't realize, hey, if you sing all the time, you actually get better. I just thought you had to be born with it, which could be true to some extent, but one can also learn. And so by never singing my whole life, now I have the last few years, and I'm slowly getting a little bit better. And not for like performance, but just for enjoyment. Whereas if I would have gone with that my whole life, if I would have known, hey, you can develop these skills by doing it, by practicing. I thought singing was something you had to have a talent for. And that goes a long way for sure, but being able to sing for fun, just for enjoyment for oneself, I only started doing in my car a few years ago. And then I noticed, hey, I'm getting a little bit better because I can sing this whole song without feeling like I can't sing a high note. And then as time goes on, there are more and more songs that I can get through the whole thing. So I do feel like the more that we drop what is not us, what has been conditioned into us, the false beliefs that we have, it's possible that we get more in alignment with what we wanted to be when we came here. And we might be able to connect with those gifts again. That's one of my hypotheses, because a lot of times when people are diagnosed with a mental health condition, they're trying to, function as sort of some semblance of their conditioned self, meaning the false self that they were created as through external pressures and external conditioning and schooling and parenting and everything. And after that all falls apart, one could try to recover, in quotes, and recover that, get that back. Or one could say, hey, what did I really want to do when I was as young as I could remember wanting to do? Maybe I can get with that. And I do feel the more that I talk to myself and by doing that in dialogue, creating my own thoughts and ideas and insights, the more I'm able to create that for myself, the less conditioned I am with other people's ideas about what life should be about. And so I feel like over time the universe is allowing me to connect more with that. And that's more hopeful to me than saying, oh, try to get some dumb job that you don't like and work there just a little bit for the sake of saying that you can function. And I'm not against jobs and stuff, and I will probably get one next year. But this year I have been working a little bit, but mostly focusing on non-doing in order to undo the doership circuitry so that when the manic energy comes in, it doesn't turn into a heightened doer, spending and hedonism and all those things. Like that can be somewhat deconditioned from the brain. So yeah, really happy about this. And then my friend also gave me this book because he has a couple of them that he likes to give away. And I don't know that much about Joseph Campbell. I think I have Oh, I have a book called Awakening the Heroes Within, and I haven't read all of it so much. I have way too much to read. But I will go through this, and I am curious about what he says, especially after reading those quotes where he does make the leap, saying that a person diagnosed with schizophrenia is drowning in the same water that a mystic can swim. So if it's all the same water, it's a matter of learning how to swim. And part of what we're drowning in are words, I feel. Thoughts. A lot of it is thoughts. And those thoughts we've usually been given by other people. That system of thinking was given to us. It was conditioned into us. And when we go into manic consciousness or subjective consciousness, it's a different algorithm of words. I wouldn't even say thinking. It's, I think, different in that instead of projecting thoughts, which makes something objective. So if I'm projecting a thought, like say a judgment about someone, like that person is mean, I've just objectified them with my own projection. And of the infinite bits of information about that particular being or human, I've decided to project the thought, that person's mean, and that's like an infinitesimal little thing that might not even be true. But a lot of times when I project that onto somebody, they start to live up to that projection. And that's the same thing with somebody getting a mental health label and being told it's forever. We often end up trapped in that, especially when it comes from some kind of authoritative entity like a medical system. Just like how parents could tell us something, since they're an authority in our life, we can take it on and think that thought for the rest of our life. And it's not something we came up with ourselves. The whole system of thinking isn't something we came up with ourselves. It's sort of an old, outmoded way of being, which is projecting and then believing what we just projected and thinking that it's objective. We think it's actually objective. It's not. But in that way, we actually objectify something by projecting onto it. We tell that thing that we're looking at what it is, whereas the other process is the reverse, is waiting and taking it in and waiting for the information that has fully been received by all of our senses to give voice to something in our minds that we might speak out loud. Like for me, I've talked about a little bit how I don't pre-form sentences in my mind. I don't actually know what I'm going to say next. And that is why I could talk to myself for a long time, because I don't know what I'm going to say next. So I'm just as surprised as anything else. So I don't know where to go next, but I feel like going to this website that I found called Peerpocalypse. Peer, P-E-E-R, apocalypse, like apocalypse, but Peerpocalypse, to do with peers, like mental health peers. And I didn't know about this conference. I think it goes on in Oregon, and they've had it in 2017 and 2018, and it's going to happen again May 20th to 23rd, 2019. So it's going to happen again, and I looked on the slides from the conference this year, and I can just tell by looking at the topics that this is quite an enlightened or higher consciousness in terms of how they're approaching mental health. So one slideshow, and you can download the presentation slides, is the impact of sexual assault on mental health. Well, duh, but that's not something they really talk about in the system when it's very prevalent in terms of somebody's history. And then there's one, Hearing Voices Network, mini training, peer-run crisis, respites or respites, It's Our Time. And then intentional peer support, foundation for various roles in support, and Cognitive liberty. This one struck me. It's a human rights perspective on mental health. This workshop will introduce participants to cognitive liberty, i.e. the right to experience any thought, feeling, belief, and expression of such, as long as they are not harming others. The workshop will discuss the ideas of cognitive liberty. Scholars and advocates apply to various marginalized groups, including people diagnosed with mental illness. Blah-de-blah-de-blah. So our perceptions, if we're diagnosed as being psychotic or something, are marginalized, and they're thought to be false beliefs. I would, in my perspective of how I look at my own experience, I did a process of questioning the process of belief itself. So by not believing in the process of belief at all, if one kind of weirdo thought came into my brain that was not nice or helpful, I just wouldn't believe it at all. It was just a watching of it arising with no attachment of a believer to it. And when I was able to do that, would just look at it without believing it, like just because it's there, like someone's against me or something bad's gonna happen, doesn't mean I need to believe it. I could watch it. And so by doing that and not believing it, if I don't believe something bad's gonna happen, if I believe it, I'm gonna be afraid, and it's gonna create the next thought, like this is gonna happen next time you go out. But if I didn't believe the first thought, the next one's likely not going to follow. And if it does, then I don't believe that. And it just, when it's not believed, when it's just watching arising in consciousness, it has no energy. So the energy is the belief and the fear of it that comes with believing it. But when one doesn't believe it, there's not really much fear because it's nothing to be believed. So the fear is what would generate the next fearful thought, the state of fear. So, I personally like to detangle from belief itself as much as I can, especially in that process when it's a bit more intense. And then there was a workshop about creating your memoir of lived experience, and then nothing about us without us. Pure nothing without about us without which one of us? I guess people are still having stuff done to them without their consent, or them as a part of the process. And that's the scariest part for me, going to the hospital, and that's why I have refused to go the last 3 times I've had a crisis and dealt with it myself as best I can. And then perception, what do you see? What do you see? What I see? So it's talking about perception, and so it's talking about perception. I don't know I haven't looked at the slides yet, but to have a workshop that talks about perception and that talks about cognitive liberty, and it talks about this one I didn't say yet because I wanted to save the best in my mind for last, which was a presentation, what is reality? So here they're talking about what is reality, what is perception, how does perception work, which are more fundamental questions. And these are the things that I've talked to myself about for 2 years. Like, what is reality? What is the nature of perception? How does it work? I've talked about it in many different ways, and I will continue to, because I've come upon a different languaging that is giving rise to things feeling a little bit more integrated in the way I can talk about them. And that's sort of the view of subjective reality versus objective reality. I don't think it's a versus. I think what I've learned from Steve Pavlina, even though he doesn't have a diagnosis, he can just take these lenses on. I think I've learned that, wow, there's a time that I'm in a more objective type reality in the way my brain is looking at the world and perceiving it. Say around family members that I have a bit of conflict with, I might be projecting that they're mean or they don't understand, right? So I'm collapsing the wave function around that, and then they're probably interacting with me based on that, because we don't have an understanding as much as I thought, because I was living on my own for a really long time, and I didn't know that there were these disconnects and just real differences in the way we perceive reality. And so, to ask what is reality, that is a beautiful question. And it turns out that this presentation that's on pureapocalypse.com under conference videos and slides 2018, he says, what is reality? It turns out to be by John Harold, the same guy that I missed the recording of the webinar recently in my email because the recording failed, but we got the slides, and I talked a little bit about those the other day. Well, I want to quickly talk a little bit about what he says in these slides here. He has quite a few slide presentations or videos on his website, johnharold.net. And I haven't really watched one yet. I haven't had time, but it seems like he is pretty close to the closest of looking at things like I do. Ron Unger is another good one. A lot of peers who have experienced these things, and this isn't necessarily wrong, a lot of energy goes into, we need to change the mental health system, angry at the system, traumatized by it, which I was too, and it took me a good year or more to get over my anger about it. And during that time, I was still asking myself questions about what else this could be, and making meaning and metaphors about these types of inner experiences, and speaking about what could be happening perhaps on the brain cell level, based on these experiences and what is known in the little bit of neuroscience that I understand. It's in the mainstream to know about neuroplasticity and a bit about quantum physics based on what the belief do we know and different things like that. So his slideshow is what is reality. Many of us with psychiatric labels have been told we are out of touch with reality. But what is reality? How does it work? In this workshop, we will examine new ways to view reality that are inclusive even to those who live with unusual experiences. We will also examine the science of reality. Is it possible that those of us diagnosed with mental illness, in quotes, are actually experiencing a deeper reality, not a delusional one? And that, I'm not very good at being concise or summarizing what I'm trying to say, because I feel like I really don't know. And I just make up a lot of possibilities, because I think part of the trouble with reality as it is knowledge, and thinking one knows something is objectifying reality. It's making it known, like, I know this tiny little piece, woohoo, now I can feel good about myself. Really, I don't know anything. I just speak. When I read stuff, I kind of can read between the lines and see implicit meaning and see how it extrapolates to my experience and what it could mean about the brain and reality, and things like that. So, I don't know what reality is, and I'm starting to see, I've been talking about how it's multiple levels, and I've had experiences about how it's multiple levels. When I get to bed and realize I'm already sleeping, it feels like I just went into another level. And what I talked about yesterday with the heart pounding, it's like I realized that the being wide awake, being very conscious and awake, which allows one to see a lot of meaning and have creative perceptions, and some of the stuff he says in here, like participate with reality versus objectify it. like really dance with it, as opposed to thinking, I know this little bit, yay, and I get a reward of dopamine because I think I knew something, or I think I was right in a conversation. Rightness comes from memory and knowledge, and the fact that we think that filling our brain with memories is what is exciting, and then competing based on what is in our little brain it's not exciting at all to me. So in this slideshow that he did, I just want to quote a little bit, maybe to point you to his work. I don't want to get too much into what others are doing in my own process. I have a little bit at times, and sometimes I've been critical, yes. I'm not really critical of this guy at all. I think he is doing a great job of whatever he's doing. So he says, an exploration of the most important yet ignored topic in, quote, mental health. What is reality? So he says, just a few bits here. View reality as a multi-level phenomenon. Reconsider the belief that you're weird. Learn the basics of quantum reality or quantum mechanics. Uncover common assumptions about reality. And why explore reality? And he's going to talk about the double slit experiment. So those diagnosed with psychotic disorder are said to be out of touch with reality. Come to think of it, most diagnostic labels dispute your reality. But most mental health professionals aren't taught to think and wonder about the nature and behavior of reality. And he says, shouldn't we understand how reality works before labeling people as out of touch with reality? So, yeah, that's huge. And that's part of what I've been talking about all along. And when I've said, hey, I'm kind of angry that this person talking about quantum jumping or what have you isn't making the jump that people who are labeled with mental illnesses are having these experiences as intense experiences already, and they're thrust into it a lot of times without any will or desire. It just is something that's there, and then we don't understand what's happening, and we're trying to figure it out, and we're trying to communicate with other people who end up objectifying us and calling us mentally ill. And then the people that are in this objective consciousness that are functioning in the world can afford the $1,000 workshop to learn about altered states or quantum jumping, or like, what is that other one, like hollow sync or something like that, when you learn some kind of something, like it's an expensive workshop. So it's like people who their brain goes into that expensive workshop without ever going to the workshop. It just does it, and then we're called crazy. And I feel like the more we're in dialogue with ourselves and each other, like, again, we could use this to say, hey, let's try and teach all the psychiatrists about the nature of reality. Why don't we just talk to each other? Why do we need that middle person? Like, we don't need to convince them, when I've talked to myself in isolation mostly about this stuff, and I'm finding other people who are saying almost the exact same thing in other ways. So, yeah. So it says, National Institute of Health, psychotic disorders are severe mental disorders that cause abnormal thinking and perceptions. People with psychoses lose touch with reality. Well, I think there's many realities, and there's different algorithms of the brain that would get us in touch with different dimensions and things like that. And then it says here, 2 of the main symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are false beliefs, something that's thinking that someone is plotting against you, or the TV is sending you a secret message. Hallucinations are false perceptions, such as hearing, seeing, or feeling something that is not there. And, you know, he's making this statement of uncovering the assumption that there's a reality out there that exists independently of us. and like that it's an objective thing. And you know, that could be true to some extent, but it's probably based on the way your brain is working. So your brain can be in an objective consciousness or it can be in a subjective consciousness. And I think this comes into play with, so yeah, he's saying that means something must be wrong with you if you're not in touch with this objective reality. And yeah, mainstream models of reality don't accommodate unshared experiences. So instead of viewing mental illness as a disease or disorder, consider viewing it as a conflict over reality. And that could be true. I think it's true. I feel that part of what we could do with bipolar is teach people how to be more manic, because everyone would want that. We don't want the downside of falling out of it, but I think the falling out of it is falling out of subjective reality, where things are more wavy. You know, he says at some points his reality was more wiggly, and he shows a little thing about a double slit experiment here to do with quantum physics, and that's way later on in this thing. But what he's trying to say is, if you know the double slit experiment, I always forget it, but I was reminded of it here. And if they put some waves through two slits, if there's a camera recording, it goes and it hits the plate on the end as two slits. But if there's no camera on, then it'll go and hit the plate as waves. So if it's not recorded, it's waves. If it's recorded, it's an object. It's the two slits. You can look it up. And the insight I had into my what I would extrapolate to what I talk about, I wouldn't only say this is about, oh, is reality a wave, like subjective, participatory, kind of weird, or is it objective, like billiard balls, and I'm like this one billiard ball, and when I hit another one, there's a reaction of some kind. And what I saw from this is something else to do with the brain. So he's saying, okay, we're not just an observer, we're a participant in reality, which makes sense. Like, we're all in reality. It's all of it. It's not like I'm this thing sitting on reality. Like, no, that's not how it is. But what he was showing with this double slit experiment that is important, and this isn't something that I've talked about too much, is that, okay, so particles can behave like waves or particles, and so recorder's on, reality shows particles. And if the recorders are not on, the recorder's there, but it's not on, reality goes wavy. So I would say that wavy is like subjective reality. It's not, the wave function isn't collapsed. It's still wavy. Whereas objective reality is like particles. When we're in mania, we're in this subjective reality and everything's good and people seem to be good too with us and moving around, participating with us, like as one consciousness, as one big wave. And then as that starts to lose energy, I feel like our brain sort of goes back into a state of objectifying And we resist that. That's why it's an awful transition. It's not fun. And I think we kind of realize what's happening. We go kicking and screaming. But if we could learn how to accept that transition, like that's the thing. To say, oh, reality is wavy and it should be wavy all the time is to me the same as saying I should be able to be manic all the time. I should be in this participatory reality where everything's magical and quite fluid. And I don't want to be in this objective where, and so if we kick and scream through that process, it gets noticed. And then not only do we go back to having an objective type consciousness, but we get objectified by psychiatry, which if we didn't go kicking and screaming, we might not. And people might not take notice of us. But going back into objective consciousness could be just something that happens. And realizing when that's happened would be the same as realizing one just woke up in the morning. And it's like, okay, well now it's time to get on with the day. It's not dream time anymore. But I do think there's different levels to waking reality, and the level of thought and objectifying things based on projecting our thoughts is a type of sleepwalking because we're not fully awake. So the subjective wavy consciousness is actually being more awake, I feel. And I was talking yesterday about how a lot of times we don't realize that we're that awake because there's no longer a recorder. The recorder is memory, and the self is made up of a bunch of memories. And a lot of times in mania, the memories are still mixed in, and they get energized, and then we talk fast based on those memories. But what I really want to say about this is recording is what makes something a particle or like an object. Not recording keeps it as a wave. It keeps it open and unknown. And this is where I need to make a leap to the work of J. Krishnamurti, whom I haven't talked about a lot, but I feel like people like us, if we really understood Krishnamurti's teachings, it would be really helpful. And the only way to understand it is to read it and really ponder into it and go into it deeply. I feel like it changes the brain. But if you're familiar with his work somehow, you would know that he talks about watching without recording. So if you compare this to the Slit experiment, if we're looking at things with our memory, we're looking at reality with our recordings. Our memories are our recordings. It's what we've recorded in our brain. Memory. And then we project those memories. And that limits and objectifies what we see. We're looking through our memories. And the moment now is not a memory. It's something brand new. And if you've ever been in mania, you realize how new everything is. When we go into that, everything looks new because we're no longer looking through our memories, which are a past that is no longer with us. So in the same way, if we can be awake and aware in the moment, in order to have access to creative and participatory perception based on the moment now, not based on our projections from memory, which is not happening now. If we can be with that without recording, then the world is more wavy. It is more fluid because we're not thinking that it's the way we think it is. We get to see how it is in the moment. So he actually has a video on YouTube like watching without recording. So if you compare that to this double slit experiment and the recorder's not on, things stay wavy and a lot more information is available to us as waves. You know, even the diagram shows all these waves going through and hitting the plate, like through the whole square, through the whole rectangle, there's these waves. Whereas with the double slit and this rectangle and then the photographic plate, if we're recording or projecting, I would say, with our brains, we just see these recordings on the plate, like these little slits. So we have access to a lot less of what is available. Like what's available through the whole field of waves is infinitely greater than a little slit of particles. So I feel like when we record, or when we're looking at the world through our recordings of memory, we're making our eyes into double slits, and we're turning what we see into just little tiny particles. And sometimes it gives us less access to, it gives us way less information access, and it gives us a sort of tunnel vision. And that's why I don't buy into this whole bit about focus, because focusing is projecting a tiny stream of thought, and it gives us less access to what is here in the moment now. We're telling our memories to tell us what to focus on, which is something we've been told. And I think that's the main problem, is projecting things that we've been told and we recorded, and thinking that they are our own, and like we own them, like we're attached to them and identified with them. And yeah, so that was kind of a long-winded explanation of that. I don't know if it makes any sense, but when I saw this and I saw the little diagram saying not recording data and it's all wavy, we're not recording. And this is the thing, when one moves from recording as a method of gathering knowledge to use later to not recording at all, then in the moment there's a creative perception that creates the words to say. I remember Eckhart Tolle trying to describe how he says the words without thinking of them. But one can learn to do that, and in that way one doesn't own any of the words that they say. One can be silent and look around, and what we see will create the next perception. And for me, I usually write them down and then talk about them later. I don't store them in my brain, I store them on a piece of paper. If I had to swirl the things I wrote down around in my brain all day, there wouldn't be any RAM, like random access memory or processing power, to have the next thing come to mind. So I actually feel like forgetting is more important than remembering, because remembering will limit our reality, whereas forgetting opens it up. And then he says, perhaps these aren't signs of illness, but signs of awakeness. And I would tend to agree. Signs of awakeness. And sometimes it's a rude awakening. And so yeah, you're a participant creator of reality. There's no reality out there, only the one in here. It's hard to say about that. I wouldn't want to get attached to it's only subjective, or it's only wavy and it's not particly at all. I was thinking while I was driving that a particle might not be what reality is, but it might be that by which we can interface with reality, or it makes things slower to have particles than to be able to be like, I want a notebook, and it just appears out of nowhere. It makes us be able to create with reality. So it might not be reality. Reality might be waves, but there wouldn't be any touch without this feeling of solidness. And maybe it's a temporary measure. So the other thing too is that I feel that since I've noticed, okay, sometimes I'm in this subjective consciousness, but I need to be aware that other people around me might be in the objective state. They might be objectifying me, or what I've realized is some of the people who are older, especially, they want to be an object. They don't want to be this wavy subject that has to all of a sudden be, oh, we're all one. Like, a lot of people want their beliefs. They want their projections. They want to believe they're separate. They want to believe they're a billiard ball. And I think it's part of compassion to allow those people to do that and live their life out that way if they want to. So just as we who are going into these subjective states and being diagnosed with mental illnesses might be like, well, my reality is just as real. If people are thinking they're objects, let them think they're objects. But I wouldn't say necessarily that it's only subjective, because there could be a danger in that. I think that for me, I'm realizing that when my brain is in a higher energy state, I'm way more awake, I have access to more information, and then that eventually slows down. And I think the transition between that subjective state and the objective state is it's like going through a time warp. It's like going through a wormhole. It's like going through a black hole. It's freaking scary. But it can be short-lived. But when we think that switch of the brain state and the brain algorithm, the trouble is, in the subjective reality, we realize there's no me, there's no separate self. And we're okay with that as long as things are going along fine. And then when we have to go back to being self-conscious, we might not have realized that we were in a state where there was no self. And a lot of people just like the comfort of feeling like a separate self. It makes things a lot easier sometimes. It makes you feel like you don't have to participate and create every single second. People who are bipolar and have mania, they get all creative. But creativity, we get further and further away from the self. And I don't think the self is a good thing per se, but I don't think it's bad. I think it slows things down. If we were all in one human consciousness, participating and creating and in dialogue with each other and trying to make this heaven on earth, we'd have a lot of work to do. Like, we wouldn't be able to sit and watch TV and be entertained. And that's very comforting to be able to do sometimes. So, and maybe the brain can't handle being in that hyper creative mode all the time. It doesn't seem like it can. That's not really functional if somebody wants to eat. So some things do, at this point, I feel, need to be objective. And perhaps we can learn when what is happening. And even when we're back in like an objective type consciousness, I still feel it's possible that it's more of an illusion of free will. But it's comforting to feel like we have a free will, that we have choice. I don't know if we do have choice. I don't think we do, because if our whole consciousness as our self, our conditioned self, has been installed into us, and we're choosing one thing that was installed or another, is that really choice? Like, to choose between one way we've been programmed and another? And then we can't see the whole expanse of possibility and all that part of reality that we can't see. So objective consciousness is how we've been conditioned, and it limits our reality. And I think that is what the brain needs in its lower energy sleepwalking state. because in the higher energy state, we're processing a lot more information and seeing a lot more of what's available. So objectivity isn't necessarily bad. It's just sort of a filter that tunes us into very little information and prevents that sort of information overload in a way. So yeah, I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I do feel like people who go into these other states can say things that might help open up people to seeing things for themselves. Because the thing is, people in objective consciousness, their whole consciousness has been conditioned, and they think that they came up with that themselves, which they didn't. So then if we, as people who go into the subjective, participatory, perceptive mode that's creative, if we just say to the objective people, no, think this or think that or believe this or this is the way it is, and tell them to commit that to their memory, and put it over old programs, their brain is still operating in the same way. So it's not going to help. The only thing that will help is for them to see it for themselves, to see that they've been conditioned to see life in a certain way, and there are other ways to look at it. And when we look at it in other ways, it changes the brain, it changes what we can see, and it changes what we have access to. And that would radically change what we do and how we behave, because it would just open up different possibilities. And it takes a lot of capacity to learn when that happens. And learning isn't remembering. So it's completely different. I would say a lot of it, most of it, is in Krishnamurti's teachings and understanding them, which isn't understanding anything. It's just seeing how the brain is operating now and not even changing it to something. We can't change it. Perception of the moment changes the brain, and not recording in order to project, but seeing and dropping that to be open to learning the next thing. And we don't choose that. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. And yeah, and I feel like I'm definitely in the more energized state now, which would be more creative. And I bought a couple of friends on Amazon, and I'll introduce you to them on Saturday. I don't know how long that will last, but just had this movement to buy them. And after listening to Steve Pavlina's Day 21, which was about playfulness, and I used to be really playful, and mania is often really playful. So I'll stop there for tonight, and tomorrow I have a haircut, and then out for dinner with some friends, and Thursday I see my counselor, and Friday I work, so I don't know how much time I'll get to talk to myself, but then I'll have some time to talk to myself, and I might try to talk to myself as much as I can over a week, just to get a bunch of it out of my system. So yeah, talk to me later.